We start with the customary disclaimer that you will all be used to, and then we will tell you a little bit about a high-level overview of the year under review, bearing in mind that 6 months have now gone by since our financial year end. We'll talk a bit about the operational performance and outlook. Caleb will deal with the financial performance and also the outlook there, and will then conclude, after which Sikanati will introduce Minister Gordhan to say a few words. So I think it's fair to say that the results are disappointing. We would have liked to do better. We did record revenue of some 200 billion rand. Sales were, however, 1.3% lower than in the prior year, and that is reflective both of capacity shortages as well as adverse economic conditions. The team did well in terms of bringing cost savings to the table, some 16.3 billion rand in saved costs during the year. However, this was largely absorbed by excess diesel consumption during the year to minimize the impact of load shedding. EBITDA, that is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, improved to 37 billion rand, and that is as a result of a growth in revenue, and the revenue grew because we had higher tariffs, and we were able to achieve an operating profit of 9.2 billion in a challenging environment. However, as everybody in South Africa is aware by now, we carry an unsustainable debt burden, gross debt of some 484 billion at year end, and that leads us to incur net finance cost of some 31.3 billion rand. And when you add that to the operating profit, that leads you then to a net loss of 20.5 billion. So this is a very clear indication that our debt burden is simply not sustainable and that we need to find a structural solution to that. We did well on cash management. We were fortunate in providing, and the team are paying particular attention to, we were fortunate in prevailing in a number of court disputes with NERSA. As we've said before, we don't particularly want to take our regulator to court. Unfortunately, under current legislation, that is the only avenue open to us, and we therefore had to revert to the courts, and we were able to prevail on a number of occasions. Caleb will again talk to you more about that. We're very grateful for government support of some 49 billion that we received during the year to support our status as a going concern, and for the further 56 billion rand is allocated for that, and we are reserving these funds for debt servicing. Now again, this is not a position that we'd like to be in, and it points again to the need to resolve the debt issue, but also if we're able to achieve cost-reflective tariffs, then that will go a long way to enabling us to reduce our reliance on the fiscus for continuing support. So we have made progress. You may recall that in November 2018 we had significant shortages of coal at many of our power stations. This created a situation where we urgently had to go into the market and on a short-term basis procure coal. And as is often the case, when something is in high demand and short supply, the price went up. So we saw that our coal cost for the year went up by some 16.3%. We are, however, projecting that in the current financial year, that cost will increase by only 0.3%, so significantly lower than the rate of inflation. So we've managed to claw back some of those expensive contracts, and we are addressing the issue of the cost of coal very actively. As I mentioned earlier, we had to spend money on diesel to fuel our open cycle gas turbines, which we use to minimize the impact of load shedding. And again, we are, through various measures that we've taken, able to reduce those costs on a forecast basis for the current financial year, FY21, by some 30%. So you can see that we are trying to move forward in keeping some of our major controllable cost elements under control as much as possible. We've spoken often in this venue about the reliability maintenance program that was launched at the end of FY20, and as we speak today, in October, more than 14% of our units are off on planned maintenance. So we've really stepped up our maintenance efforts, and ironically that reflects in the calculation of our energy availability factor. So that looks a bit lower, but it's because we're doing so much more maintenance. And that, we think, is an essential intervention in order for us to improve the reliability and stability of our generation system. Our colleagues at Group Capital have excellent timing. Just in time for the announcement of these results, Kusile Unit 2 yesterday was declared ready for commercial operation. So that unit is now able to contribute about 800 megawatts to the grid. It's the second unit at Kusile, and we are very happy with the progress that we are making in continuing with the completion of Kusile. As you're aware, we are making good progress in resolving the design errors that have plagued Medupi in particular, and we've already successfully implemented design modifications on 4 units by the end of this month, and we intend to have those design issues finally resolved by the end of this financial year, i.e. by around about March of next year. So good progress on that front as well to resolve the difficulties with our new build program. Restructuring of Eskom is a major theme, and it enables us to move with a changing energy landscape, not only in South Africa but also globally, as the world is moving to more distributed generation and also to a far greater contribution from renewable energy. And the legal separation of our transmission division is an essential part towards enabling this transition to take place. And we have as a target date, depending on obtaining the necessary regulatory and other government approvals, the full legal separation of transmission as an independently governed entity by December of next year, which of course will enable us to start procuring significant additional capacity from independent power producers. We have been in the news for more assertively pursuing those that consume electricity but don't pay for it. And this effort has yielded remarkable results, very positive, in spite of some very challenging economic conditions. In particular, the top 20 defaulting municipalities had a 17% increase in their payment rate from March 2020 to September of this year. So that's very good progress made by Monde Bala and his team. Monde is, of course, the Managing Director of Eskom Distribution. Another area that's been long outstanding has been Soweto, and even there, thanks to interventions by the distribution team, we have seen some good progress, and the payment rate improved from 12.5% to some 21% at the end of March. The chairman made reference in his introductory remarks to the impact of the global pandemic, and it has not left Eskom unaffected. We invoked our disaster plan. This was one of the key risks that we had identified in our risk prevention plan, and we kicked that into action in February 2020, and I think we were quite successful in combating the spread of the pandemic within Eskom, but also at the same time continuing with key and critical activities even as the nation went through lockdown. And at this point, I would really like to express my gratitude to the workers of Eskom at all levels who continued with doing essential work during this lockdown period. It was very heartening that we were able to continue doing operations in our power stations, on our transmission grid, and also in our distribution business. Of course, we saw a significant demand drop. So during lockdown level 5, we saw some 5.6 gigawatts dropping off the system. That recovered slightly to 3.3 gigawatts during level 4. And where we are at the moment is that we are pretty much at the forecast demand levels that we had anticipated prior to lockdown beginning. So we are quite comfortable that demand has now recovered to what it was anticipated to be prior to the pandemic kicking in. We took the opportunity, the unfortunate opportunity of the pandemic to do short-term maintenance, and that added about 2,500 to 3,000 megawatts of sustainable capacity to the grid. And this was very important to provide additional stability to our grid. And by all accounts, those short-term interventions appear to be sticking, and that has given us additional faith in our system, which is still plagued by high levels of breakdowns, but also due to high demand. I may just remind you that we went through the coldest winter in a decade, and that of course led to a significant spike in demand, which unfortunately led to the implementation of load shedding. We had to delay some of our major capital projects, and this was due to the fact that we were unable to accept from a medical safety perspective the congregation of large numbers of staff, but also of contractors on our sites, purely to prevent the spread of the virus. So we had to postpone that, and that caused some significant delays. Tragically, like so many other families in South Africa, we too lost 27 of our Eskom colleagues to the pandemic. 3 contractors lost their lives as well to the disease as at Thursday of this week. We are very wary of the impact of the pandemic, and we have weekly ExCo meetings to address this and to make sure that we are not caught unawares by a looming second wave. So it is a significant risk factor. I think everybody saw what happened yesterday to financial markets when it became apparent that the second wave of the pandemic was upon us, and lockdown restrictions were imposed across numerous European nations, and it's clear that this is going to be with us for the foreseeable future, so we have to live with the new normal. Just incidentally, I heard a very good quote the other day: we may all be tired of the virus, but the virus isn't tired of us, and we should bear that in mind. So if we look at the operational performance and outlook, it's clear that we've got some significant challenges that we need to keep in mind. Our energy availability factor is low, at 66.6%. And as I said, this is due to the fact that we have a very unreliable and unpredictable generation system, but it's also due to the fact that we are doing significantly more maintenance, and that requires us to take units off for extended periods of time while we repair them and while we do that mid-life refurbishments that should have been done earlier. It's also worth pointing out, regrettably, we don't want to remind ourselves of it, but on the 9th of December 2019, we had to implement stage 6 load shedding in South Africa, and I think that was a low point in Eskom's 97-year history. And the only good thing that I think we can say about it is that it created the platform for change going forward, and it lent a new urgency and a new resolve to Eskom to turn the business around and to ensure that we can put load shedding behind us. We still have challenges on environmental performance, particularly at our Kendal power station. Under new management at Kendal, we are paying significant attention to the entire value chain, from coal quality through to our dust handling plant as well as ash handling, and the results are becoming quite apparent in the emission from Kendal improving steadily. So that's a very pleasing performance, and I would like to commend Bruce Moyer and his team for doing a great job at Kendal. The supply chain recovery is a big issue in Eskom's life. We procure about 140 billion rands worth of goods and services every year. So that's a very large number, and you can imagine that if we're able to save even a modest percentage of that, the impact that it has on our income statement is really significant. And therefore we require the resolution of some of the obstacles that make it very difficult for us to have both a commercial but also a very agile approach to our procurement practices. And that has been hampering both our operations but also the delivery of our maintenance program. So we are engaging with National Treasury in an endeavour to debottleneck this particular challenge that we've got. In spite of the improvement in payment rates that I alluded to earlier, municipal arrear debt still increased by an unsustainable 41% to 28 billion rand at the end of March 2020. And again, it points to the fact that there's a structural solution that needs to be found to the issue of municipal debt. We are engaging, and we will be engaging next week again, as a matter of fact, with the political task team under the leadership of Deputy President Mabuza to address this particular matter. We have seen instances of community resistance to improving payment levels, vandalism of equipment, theft, also threats to employee, and these have hampered our efforts to curb electricity theft and non-payment. And hence, unfortunately, we've had to resort, in order to protect our distribution networks in areas that have a high susceptibility to electricity theft and illegal connections, to load reduction, where we anticipate high demand that would cause damage to our network, and then of course we have to cut back in order to protect our transformers, which otherwise would be damaged. So there were 5 critical risks that materialized during March 2020, so that it never rains but it pours. We had a global pandemic, we had an IT system meltdown, we had a stage 4 load shedding thanks to a incident at Kuburg where some of the sea life came into our cooling system. We had to shut down one of the reactors from a safety perspective, and we also had some significant issues relating to the global economic environment with the sovereign, so the Eskom credit rating downgrade, all against the backdrop of COVID-19. So it was a particularly challenging time to have all of these risks manifest themselves all at the same time. But it's not all doom and gloom. I think we are making good progress, in spite of the fact that we are still battling with the legacy of our poor maintenance practices in the past. EAF still lower than we would have liked it to be. Our unplanned capability losses higher than in the prior year, with average partial load losses. With other words, the entire unit doesn't come off, but we are unable to run the unit at its full capacity, and that increased to an average of 4.6 gigawatt during the year. Now, coal energy utilization factor increased to 93%. Now, you may think that this is a good thing. Actually, it's not a good thing. What it means is that we are running these old coal-fired units of ours harder and harder in order to keep the lights on. So we are taking this veteran car, if you will, and we are running it flat out, redlining it all the way, and that exacerbates the challenge of reliability and availability. So again, it speaks to the need for urgently adding additional generation capacity to the grid in South Africa, that we can preserve these coal assets and run them to the end of their lives. Distribution did well. The transmission performance was unfortunately not where it should have been. due to some structural issues. You will also have seen the recent disruption of electricity to Velkom, and in particular to Harmony Gold Mine. And that was the consequence of the theft of one of the cable stays that held a pylon on our transmission line upright. And it speaks to the fact that we really need to start protecting our infrastructure and looking at the sources of demand for scrap metal in South Africa, because that is really what drives this epidemic of theft. On the brighter side of things, Medupi 3 and 2 achieved commercial operation during the financial year, and we were able to expand our transmission system. The new builds, we have done the design modifications, units 3, 6, 1 and 4 in that order, and the prognosis so far is very positive. We are quite confident that we've now got to the bottom of what had ailed these units, and so far the output has recovered remarkably well, as evidenced by Medupi Unit 3 performing significantly. We now have these 5 units in commercial operation, almost 4,000 megawatts at Medupi and another 1,600 megawatts at Kusile. So the new build, way over budget, way behind time, but they are now coming onto the grid and making a much needed contribution. We will be completing Medupi Unit 3 for commercial operation by July next year, and then Kusile will come online, Unit 3, at March 21. So this is slightly more positive. As I've said, the environmental performance is not where we would like it to be, in particulate emissions, and again, Kendal being the worst offender there, but we are seeing some significant improvements. A trend that I think we don't speak often enough about in South Africa is water consumption, and you can see here that our water consumption has increased. We live in a very arid country, and we have to be far more aware and conscious of our impact on the water table, particularly as climate change, of course, changes the nature of our rainfall patterns. A very proud milestone is that we have now cumulatively connected some 1.5 million households to the grid in South Africa since the electrification program started. And I think this is something that really speaks to the benefit that electrification can bring to all of our citizens, of course, coupled with the free basic electricity program, in terms of which indigent South Africans can qualify for free electricity once they register with the local municipality. Safety was slightly better. Our lost time injury rate improved, but we did suffer 9 contractor fatalities, and this is something that we really need to get our arms around. It's an unacceptably high number. 1 fatality is 1 too many, and we have, as an EXCO, resolved to redouble our efforts to get to the grips with the safety challenge. As far as employee fatalities were concerned, we were fortunate enough to report no fatalities during the year. Our BE spend was particularly high, 102 billion, so we do play an important role in transformation in the South African economy, and we continue to improve our racial and gender equity, but sadly we did not meet our target for disability equity, so that's a focus area going forward. And we impacted the lives of some 1.5 million South Africans through our corporate social investment program. The turnaround is proceeding well. I've spoken about the operations recovery. We are looking at our income statement, even though it's not reflected in the results that you'll see today, not yet. But some of the green shoots that I refer to, you can already start seeing in terms of reduced coal cost, in terms of reduced diesel cost, and there are other cost levers that we are pulling, reducing our headcount by some 2,000 through natural attrition without resorting to forced retrenchments during 2020, calendar 2020, and we are seeing those payment levels improving. We have to continue to improve our balance sheet, and we are excited at the Eskom Compact that was agreed at NEDLAC. We think this is a very positive development, and we are eagerly anticipating the further development and implementation of this potential structural solution, in addition to green financing, which we still believe holds a lot of hope for us as we make the just energy transition. Good progress on business separation. We are now functioning well, and I think it's apparent that the business focus that we're driving from a culture perspective is now firmly in place, and we are making good progress in disposing of non-core assets. We have a very, very large property portfolio. If we were a listed company, our property portfolio would rank us among probably about the second biggest listed property company on the Joburg Stock Exchange. So you can understand that there's a huge asset that we can convert into cash, which we need. So that program has been kickstarted, and we are closely cooperating with the Department of Human Settlements to also ensure that where there are people in need of housing, that we do not leave those aspirations unattended. Lastly, and this is where I would like to thank every Eskom employee, every colleague of mine who works really long and hard to make this organization a success. The culture is changing. We are improving. We're getting the focus right. It's a long journey. It's a big ship. It doesn't turn overnight. But we believe that we are making good progress on improving the culture of our organization. Finally, the sun is rising. It's not setting on Eskom, and that is a positive development for us. Generation is looking better already. Every morning when I wake up, the first thing I do is to look at the system update, and that has been green now for a month or longer, and that is a very heartening sight. It really does lift my spirits to see that green light in the morning. However, we are going to be retiring our end-of-life power stations over the next decade, and that means that we are going to be taking out of commission between 8 to 10 gigawatts of capacity, and it means that we urgently need more capacity. Hence, we have welcomed the procurement program that NERSA consented to, that was announced by Minister Mantashe, and we strongly support that effort. I was talking again yesterday to Bernard Magoro at the IPP office, and we are in agreement that we are going to be driving additional electricity procurement as a matter of priority. So I'm very pleased to say that there is now strong alignment between ourselves and the IPP office to enable this rollout of new generation capacity. But this doesn't come for free. We need to connect all of this new capacity to the grid, and that requires us to invest over the next decade about 118 billion rand in expansion of our transmission grid. So that is a big ask, but it's part of infrastructure development. Typically a transmission line has a life of some 100 years. So once that investment is made, you really have an asset that can continue to contribute to the economy for the long run. We spoke about distribution that is looking better, and the just energy transition strategy is, we think, going to bring the equitable introduction of a cleaner and greener generation technology to South Africa, while addressing the very valid and just concerns of those communities who have invested their lives in the coal value chain. So we're very cognizant of those concerns, and we are continuing to engage with those communities with a view to creating meaningful socio-economic interventions that will support them going forward. The financial position remains challenging, and this is largely as a result of our debt, but also as a result of tariffs that are not cost reflective, and this is what we need to address. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Caleb Kassim, who will take us through the financial performance and outlook. Thank you very much.
Has the coronavirus stopped people from clapping hands? We have to start small. The powerful virus.
I thought Andre was taller than me, but let me increase this. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, Minister, Chairman, and GCE. Thanks for the opportunity to share the results. As the GCE has said, it's been a disappointing year financially, quite challenging operationally as well. But let me get into some of the detail and to provide more color to the financials. And more importantly, as Andre has ended, what do we see as the outlook going forward? Maybe not immediately, but in the short term. Okay, I think at the end of the day, before we even look at revenue, we need to look at our own cost base as Eskom. The consumers have to pay for the cost that we incur, being the production costs, our employee costs, your capital expenditure, and the big one is the debt service costs. What have we done over the last financial year? We have looked at our operating costs, and you will see in my presentation, in particular, your employee benefits costs remains flat year on year. Your operating costs remain flat. Your capital cost then reduces quite significantly based on what we can afford in terms of liquidity. But the one that does increase is your primary energy, and I'll go into more detail around that. At the end of the day, the amount of cash that Eskom is generating from its operations is not sufficient to cover our debt service costs. And you will see why the need and how essential the government support that Eskom has been granted in the 2020 financial year of 49 billion rand, and then the appropriations that have been awarded going forward to ensure that we can meet those debt service commitments. At the end of the day, when you sell a product, you want to ensure also the consumers are paying for it. And as a key element to our financial sustainability is what is the trend on our municipal arrear debt. We've seen in the last financial year that escalate to 28 billion at the end of March 2020, and your Soweto payments levels have improved from 12.5 to 20.7%. So what was the audit opinion that Eskom did receive? Now, I need to highlight to the audience that firstly, you've got your PFMA audit that's conducted for public entities. And on that, Eskom has got a qualified audit opinion relating to our irregular expenditure. This is a audit opinion that we've had for the last 3 years. Although progress has been made, for you to get a clean audit, you need to be able to demonstrate that there are no irregular expenditure that is occurring during the financial year. The trend is stabilizing and reducing, but with over about 6,000 contracts, it takes a lot of effort, and we remain focused on addressing that. So yes, from a PFMA perspective, we've got a qualified audit opinion. And based on our financial situation, as I've highlighted, there's focus around the material uncertainty of Eskom as a going concern. But in our directors' report, we explain why, as directors, we've signed off that Eskom remains a going concern in light of the explicit support that government has granted us in the equity support of 49 billion, 56 billion for the current financial year, and another 33 billion for the year thereafter. One of the key audit matters that was raised during this audit period was the treatment of Eskom's pension and provident fund. We have always accounted for this as a defined contribution plan over the last several years. And from our perspective as Eskom and management, the rules of the fund have not changed, nor has the accounting standard. And we have a strong opinion legally, as well as from an accounting perspective, that that treatment should continue. You will see in the financials there's extensive disclosure around this pension fund, where we provide disclosure in the event if it's treated as a defined benefit plan, the necessary disclosure is then provided. So that's a significant change from the financials compared to last year. And from a pension fund perspective, the fund is healthy. It's in a surplus position of some 35 billion at the end of March 2020. From a PFMA perspective as well, the auditors have identified reportable irregularities, 3 of them which are disclosed in the financials, and we have addressed and we have closed up one of that. With regard to the previous chairman, Mr. Mabuza, it's non-declaration in terms of his niece doing business with Eskom. He has made the necessary declarations and we have closed that. The 2 remaining ones are, as I mentioned, the qualification around irregular expenditure. That has been raised as a reportable irregularity, and we will continuously focus on that. And then there was an issue around some reporting and administration issues from our minute taking, etc. We believe that now with our permanent company secretary being appointed in, I think, June this year, his task is to address and close out that as soon as possible. So we are comfortable we can deal with those issues going forward. And then if I just go on into the next slide and talk about the irregular expenditure, our qualification and what has been the trend. So you will see there that the opening balance for the financial year was 22 billion rand. And then there was a prior year cleanup of 6.5 billion rand. Now, as we work through this and we still make changes, this creates the incompleteness and the challenge to convince the auditors that our process are now totally addressing all the issues. It contributes effectively to the qualification, but we believe we literally quite close to dealing with this issue. During the current financial year, so how much expenditure was incurred that related to irregular expenditure? Now the first bar after that is 4.5 billion rand, and it says existing irregular expenditure. So what happens here is that if you've got a contract and it's deemed irregular, and as long as you continue to spend against it, the irregular expenditure remains until it's condoned. There are some contracts that you can't easily stop and replace, so they have to continue until we see condonement, and then it's not deemed irregular. Then the new transactions that occurred in the current financial year, what were those? That was quite a small amount of 200 million. So for us, that is the positive that has come out of this financial year. And you will see that the number of transactions there that relates to that 200 million or the 191 million is 73 transactions totaling 191 million. Now let me make this point clear. Yes, we should aim for zero irregular expenditure. But the positive sign I read in from that is those are not big value transactions, the billions of rands contracts. So the checks and balances that we've definitely put in at the senior committees and the tender committees and the divisional committees, those are now picking up, and we are not accepting transactions that are not fully compliant in terms of the regulations and legislation. What it does show that we can't stop at the big committees. We have to go down right to grassroots levels where some of the smaller transactions are occurring, and we need to instill that discipline. And even on the existing irregular expenditure, we are not satisfied that there's 4.5 billion rand. That is why we want to ensure we have enabling agreements to fix that existing items in the new environment when they are renewed. And what we've done and agreed as the executive to implement a loss control department which will deal with this PFMA violations, including disciplinary actions, condemnations, recovery, and consequence management. At the end of the day, we've amended our policies to 100% align to the National Treasury instructions. We've done training. The one area that we need to work on during this financial year, of that 33 billion rand that is outstanding, there's a significant amount of condemnations that we have submitted to National Treasury, and we need to work with them to close that out based on the efforts and the controls we've now implemented to ensure that that 33 billion rand goes down in the next financial year. Then if I move on to our next slide and going into more of the financials, you will see year on year that especially at the EBITDA line, there has been an improvement from 31 billion to 37 billion rand, and as Andre has mentioned, we've generated an operating profit of 9 billion rand. But after tax, we're sitting at a 20 billion rand loss, and our EBITDA margin is up from 17.5% to 18.5%. And you will see that effectively your key financial ratios are remaining relatively consistent with last year, with no change in your cash interest cover of less than 1, which means we don't even generate enough cash to cover our interest bill. And then if you add on top of that your capital repayments, we're basically sitting at half when that ratio should be at least 1. And that's highlighted in our cash flow statement. Your gross debt to EBITDA ratio is sitting at 14 times, improved slightly from 15.7. Ideally, you want that to be in the region of 6 times, 5 times. And the debt equity improvement from last year of 3.18 to 2.45 is substantially on the back of the 49 billion rand equity support that has come through, thereby decreasing your gearing from 76 to 71. I think what I want to also highlight, you will see there that 29 is restated financials. Now, there were 3 areas that contributed to this restatement. One, first item was post-retirement medical aid. Effectively, what we've done there, we are now accruing for this liability from age 55 onwards instead of 65, because Eskom does allow for early retirement at 55 years. So we brought that into account as the restatement. Then the second item that contributed to that was VAT on the impairment of trade receivables, whereas previously we did not account for it. We've now brought that in and adjusted the financials. And then the last item relates to our capitalization of interest during construction. We've made that adjustment. Overall, the impact to 2019's restatement was in the region of about 200 million rand. Not a significant amount, but more importantly is to reflect the correctness of the financials. I thought I'd just make sure I highlight that. Moving on, in terms of your operating profit, I've touched on that, but the point I want to now go into, yes, the revenue line has gone up by some 11%, from 180 billion to 200 billion. That's on the back of a tariff increase that was awarded during this last year on average of around 13%. However, the reduction, as Andre has alluded to, the sales drop of some 1.3% has then shown a net impact of about 11%. You will see, as I mentioned, that your employee benefits remain flat at 33 billion rand, and your other operating expenditure is 18 billion. Now that 18 billion costs for this financial year 2020 also includes a write-off of 4 billion rand relating to Kusile overpayment leg, including the IDC. So had we not processed that or accounted for that as is required, that amount would be lower by about 4 billion rand, and your bottom line would have improved. So it's better than just looking at it at face value. That's an important point that needs to be highlighted. Then it's your primary energy costs. That increase of some 12 billion rand, I'll go into more detail later on the primary energy, and then you will see that below the line, our net fair value was 4.5 billion compared to 3.4 billion on the previous year. That increase in net loss is substantially linked to your financial instruments, offset by a positive gains on our embedded derivative. And then your finance charges have increased from 27 billion to 31 billion, linked to, one, the growth in debt plus your borrowing costs. And then effectively after tax, you see at a group level, literally the number remaining flat. I think just to highlight that on the depreciation side, it comes down because in 2019, we had included the depreciation for Indrina and Komati, and we put them into coal reserve, thereby accelerating their depreciation in 2019. Your electricity revenue, and let's just firstly touch on the volume side. At the bottom of the graph, you will see that the 1.3% decrease year on year, but there has been some positive with regard to international sales, growing from 12 terawatts to 15 terawatts, whereas on the domestic side, we've dropped about 5 terawatt hours. Linked substantially to the industrial sector due to the economic downturn and commodity prices. You'll see there that the average tariff for the last financial year is just over 100 cents per kilowatt hour. I think the point I want to also highlight on this slide is the IFRS 15 adjustment due to the treatment of collectible receivables. If there's any doubt, you need to then remove it from your revenue line and not account for it. You will see that that has remained relatively static at around 6 billion rand. And then the second adjustment to our revenue line is your capitalized pre-commissioning revenue, as the plants are still in their synchronization phase. Before commissioning, they only then get recognized once it's commissioned. So if I just link it back to what Andre has said, bringing Kusile Unit 2 into commercial operation will mean that that revenue that has been generated by Kusile Unit 2 previously can now be recognized as revenue on the income statement. There will be also other implications in terms of now bringing in the depreciation for that unit. Primary energy, and to really go and focus on what are the two big drivers. You will see firstly it's your coal costs that year on year has escalated by 7.9 billion rand, and that is linked to firstly in terms of the cost element of price of 10.7 billion and a lower volume during the year of 2.8, linked substantially to the lower sales, which means lower production. So on the coal side, your average cost of purchase during this last financial year was 16.3% increase, and that was on the back of procuring that necessary coal as and when was required. What we do see going forward is that rand per ton increase will be in the region of inflation for the 2021 year. So some positive elements that will appear in the next set of financials. And then on your renewable energy, you've seen that growth of 2.6 billion linked to a combination of volume of just under R1 billion, and then your price adjustments of 1.7 billion. To touch on the OCGTs, Eskom's OCGTs year on year have grown by 500 million, and similarly on the IPP side. And we purchase more from Cahora Bassa. That's the breakdown that comprises the 13% increase in our primary energy costs. From a balance sheet perspective, obviously some improvement with the equity injection. And if I start there, you can see your equity has grown from about 150 billion in 2019 to just below 186 billion rand for 2020. However, it's important to highlight that you can see that our debt and securities have also grown from 440 billion to the 483 billion rand. I'll go into more detail on the debt in a subsequent slide, but also just to then highlight that your cash and equivalents and investments has improved by some 200% from 11.6 billion in 2019 to the 35 billion at the end of March 2020, of which your cash component was 22 billion rand. Going into a bit more detail on your debt, I think the point I want to highlight here, and it's in the heading, if we look at our finance costs of 42 billion rand, and one can relate to that at an average cost of about 9.5% on 480 billion, you'd expect your interest costs to be 42 billion rand. If I then take out the finance income of 2 billion, then you get about a net finance cost of 40 billion rand for Eskom. That's almost R1 billion a week just for interest costs. That is not sustainable. And why I say it's the second largest cost, because the only other cost item that is greater than that is our coal costs. As I've shown you earlier, your employee costs are sitting at 33 billion. Your capital expenditure, you will see in a further slide, has dropped to 24 billion rand. An organization should not be spending more on interest than on capital expenditure. I think listening to the minister's speech in terms of the medium-term budget, the challenge that Eskom is facing around unsustainable debt is a mirror image to where we find ourselves at the sovereign level. Those are the challenges that are facing us as Eskom. Okay, let's move on from here. Funding during the last year, as we've touched on, we've raised 51 billion rand against a target of 46 billion. For this financial year, we need to raise 31 billion ourselves. To date, we've have commitments of 19.6 billion and constituting 2/3 there thus far. And what's important that, as you're aware, that a lot of our debt is government guaranteed. Of the portfolio of 350 billion rand that is available to Eskom, we've drawn down 313 billion. We've got another 15 billion committed, which means the guarantees that we have available is only 22 billion. Now, what's important here, it doesn't mean that once we utilize that, there's no more guarantees. As debt matures that's linked to guarantees, it then becomes available again. But what it does mean is Eskom cannot just continue to borrow, because where we are currently financially, most of the institutions will only lend the Eskom money on the back of government guarantees. Now, what does our debt maturity profile look like going forward? We are definitely not out of the woods. You will see for March 21, if I just add the interest and the capital expenditure of that 59 billion and the 37, in this year, your debt service commitments cost is 96 billion. If I bring it back to that analogy and you do it in weeks, so for capital and interest, Eskom needs to repay about 2 billion rand every week. And then it does drop.
Well, hello everyone. We're coming to you live from the SABC Outside Broadcast Center. Thanks for watching. This is SA Today. I'm Desiree Chauke. You've just been watching the presentation of Eskom's financial reports. It's a story we'll continue to unpack here on the show. Also, it's a defining weekend for the leading opposition in the country. The Democratic Alliance is electing its new leadership. That and other stories, including American politics, among some of the stories that we'll be looking at this afternoon. Let's start the show. All right, former Bosasa Chief Operating Officer Angelo Agrizzi has been granted bail by the High Court in Johannesburg. Agrizzi has been in jail since the 14th of this month after the Specialized Commercial Crimes Court, sitting in the Palm Ridge Magistrates Court, refused to grant him bail. He's facing a corruption charge which relates to the payments made to former ANC Member of Parliament Vincent Smith, who is also on bail for fraud and corruption. Agrizzi is still in hospital under police guard after suffering a heart attack.
So now that this particular court has taken the decision to overrule the initial court's decision, we're not at all worried because we have the guarantees that we've been sorting from the onset. He failed to disclose the various assets that we've brought before the court. We now have a guarantee that his villa, which is in Italy, is now going to be handed over to us in terms of a title deed, so that we know for sure that he'll stand the full trial. Our main contention was that we wanted Angelo Agrizzi as well as his co-accused to stand the full trial in order for justice not only to be seen but also to be done.
When are you expecting for that particular title deed of that particular property, which is that expensive villa to the tune of 18 million rands, to be handed over to you as the state?
So there are various time frames in which the judge has actually handed down. He mentioned that his passports must be handed by the 3rd of November. By the 10th of November, we're expecting that that particular title deed, as well as various other disclosures about his property and that of his common law wife, will be disclosed within that time frame. And another thing that we should mention, that failure to disclose all of this, and if we and various other persons find out that there's stuff that he has not disclosed, unfortunately his bail will be revoked within 48 hours.
The state in the case of the Enlightened Christian Gathering church leader and self-proclaimed prophet Shapat Bushiri, his wife Mary and 3 others has argued that they should not be granted bail. The couple, together with Landiwe and Nkokwana William, as well as Mirimudola, are appearing in the Pretoria Magistrates Court for bail application following their arrest over a week ago. They face charges of fraud to the value of 102 million rand, money laundering and the contravention of the Prevention of Organised Crime Act. Members of the church lost their monies after they joined an investment scheme through one of the couple's entities which promised 50% returns in 2 months. The state says the accused may attempt to evade trial, interfere and intimidate witnesses should they be granted bail. The National Council of Provinces Chair Amos Masondo is doing an oversight visit in Gauteng to assess the state of governance in the province. To take us through some of the findings of the visit, the chairperson Amos Masondo joins us now via Zoom. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Masondo. Thanks for making the time.
Afternoon and greetings to all the viewers.
Of course, it's too early to make determinations about the outcomes, but just give us a sense of why you were in Gauteng this week.
We had come to Gauteng, as indeed is the case in relation to all the other eight other provinces, to really provide a platform for public representatives to engage with their provinces and to be part of helping people resolve problems and challenges that are being experienced on the ground. So it was an opportunity to engage, to interact, and to pursue issues that require to be resolved and challenges that require attention.
So are you saying this is just as a matter of course? It's not necessarily as a result of a special investigation?
Not necessarily, but of course we do, as public representatives, remain aware and pay attention to issues raised in the Auditor General's report and similar other reports that talks about the issues as being experienced. So we can't really ignore reality. We have to grapple with it in a way that realistic to ensure that we add our weight and make our own contribution in addressing issues that can lead to the improvement of the quality of life of people.
Of course, when we speak about Gauteng, it's not necessarily just related to the Auditor General's report. It also extends to the SIU report, where there are current conversations about PPE corruption specifically for Gauteng. How are you engaging with that conversation?
Everything that is a challenge and a problem, any issue that affects society is our own preoccupation. In an ongoing way, we're addressing issues, and the issues that we are raised is really very important. And the fact that it arose during the COVID-19 period makes it even more important. So I'm concerned with all issues related to corruption, because when all is said and done, we are seeking to build an ethical state.
Communicated its consultation process to conclude that transaction also by February 21. With regard to the 23 billion around the equity support that was awarded in terms of Eskom's favor, of totaling 69 billion, NASA has been granted leave to appeal that. Eskom has then put in a execution order while we wait the process in terms of the appeal. On the RCA decision for 2019, of 13.3 billion. That decision in terms of the liquidation will also be made shortly. The indications are there end of November. I think what to highlight here is the bottom part. Obviously, after every financial year, we do the reconciliation to the decision, and in terms of the rules, what is then applicable and can be applied for in terms of the regulatory clearing account, Eskom makes that submission. So based on the 2020 financials, we see the RCA application for 2020 being about 10 billion rand. On the positive, the recent trend has been around 20 billion. That has halved. And what's the reason for that? We believe that in this MYPD4 decision, other than the 69 billion treatment, many of the decisions and the interpretation of the methodology in Eskom's analysis has been more correctly applied by the regulator and therefore has contributed to a much more smaller RCA submission, which will be submitted shortly. In terms of the outlook, I'm not going to touch on 2020, which we spoke on. 2021, with COVID and those implications, one does expect that the financials will deteriorate. And what we're highlighting there, it's about a 6 billion net movement on the loss, where we see that just purely from a revenue perspective, that the lockdown period and the low economic activity will have about a net 10 billion rand reduction in revenue. Obviously, with our continuous focus on costs, we look to then reduce some of that reduction to a net 6 billion. But thereafter, there is some positive signs where our outlook to 2023 sees us returning to profitability, but that is on the back of, one, dealing with our cost base as we go forward and delivering our savings and efficiency. I mentioned the tariff, and don't forget the importance of the collections from our customers. Let's not underestimate the importance of the generation sector performing. It means more cheap per plant produced, and it means you don't use the OCGTs as much, which then relieves a lot of cash and cost to the system. So we look forward to that, and as the GC has mentioned, the success we've had from our dealing with our defects. In conclusion, I've touched on all the key items, but just to reiterate, firstly, where we are, that Eskom cannot survive without the government's support. We are not a going concern. It comes out clearly in our director's report. We need to deal with that debt. 483 billion rand, that's generating around 40 billion interest cost, is not sustainable. In terms of our analysis, we believe a more sustainable debt balance of borrowing should be around 200 billion. This then allows our EBITDA margin to at least double to around 35%, and that will generate about a cash balance of 30 billion rand, which works out to about 3 months working requirements in terms of cash flows. We need to deliver on our cost savings. As we've said, we've achieved that on the back of coal optimization, reduction in capex. We've also had the increase in revenue from the international sales, and I think also we've demonstrated that in our employee benefit costs. I think it's important just to conclude as well that in terms of our employee benefit costs, there were no short-term bonuses, no bonuses that were awarded to staff. for this last financial year. When you do get the financials and you see an amount for bonus, it relates to a 13 check as people are allowed to flex their packages, but it's not a separate payout. I want to clarify that. And then also that our reduction of some close to 2,000 staff complement during this last financial year. Going forward, that a combination of those key elements of cost efficiency, reducing your debt levels, and getting the cost-reflective tariff to recover efficient costs, plus that cost of capital, would put Eskom on the track to financial sustainability, coupled with the operational sustainability. I thank you, and I hand over to Sekonati.
Thank you, Tandiwe. Colleagues, in his capacity as the representative of the shareholder, Pravin Gordon spent half the day holding this board and management to account in an AGM. In a few minutes after the minister has spoken, you will have an opportunity to put questions through to him, because he's not going to be sitting through the question and answer. He has another appointment to run to. So please start writing those questions for the minister. And Minister, please give us your remarks. Thank you very much. Sorry, colleagues, you will not be seeing him on the video, those that are in the room here. We will only be hearing the audio. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all of the people that are on one or other platform. Sekonati is censoring my photograph. That's bad news. But let me first greet the chair, Professor Mahoba, and thank him for his stewardship of the board, and thank the board for working during very difficult circumstances and continuing to apply themselves to stabilizing Eskom. My appreciation also to the CEO and the management team and all of the workers, 40,000 of them within Eskom, who've been working under difficult circumstances, but still are taking Eskom in the right direction and meeting the challenges both of the present and of the future as well. And to you all, ladies and gentlemen, welcome this afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity for making a few remarks. I also want to compliment the team at the Department of Public Enterprises that under the Director General, Mr. Takuri, has the responsibility for oversight over Eskom in a more direct way than I have. I must take this opportunity to thank the President, who recognized in 2019 fairly quickly that Eskom is not as an important entity as he described it. It is too important and too big to fail, but at the same time that it needs to undergo some drastic changes and will not be able to trade its way out of the difficulties that you've just heard about, but also some of the positive news that you've heard about. And in that sense, the President has set the pace. The Deputy President, who chairs the political task team that meets very frequently, thanks for his stewardship as well to the board and to the Chief Executive and his team on the various matters that we've actually dealt with. President having announced an economic reconstruction and recovery plan, and the Minister of Finance making his pronouncements during the medium-term budget policy statement. And it is in this context that Eskom has an important role to play to ensure in due course but with great sense of urgency security of energy supply. As the CE has mentioned, an EAF below 70% is not acceptable both to him and to all of us as well. And the quicker we get to an electricity availability factor closer to 80%, the better for the country and for Eskom also. But also Eskom has an important role to play in lowering the cost of doing business. And in that sense, references to the tariff structure and the level of tariffs, notwithstanding the contribution that it makes to the overall financial situation and health of Eskom, is something that will receive our attention constantly over and above the kind of regulatory matters that have to be dealt with. Eskom also has the opportunity, as the Chief Executive pointed out, in the weeks and months ahead, of ensuring that in deploying more renewable energy, as announced by the Minister of Minerals and Energy, who is an important partner in this process, we must promote industrialization of the various products that are utilized in the renewable energy space. I also want to repeat what has been said about the role that Eskom plays in securing a clean environment and in meeting the various emission standards that are set by the Minister of Environment, Fishery and Forestry. And dialogue amongst all of us is absolutely key to enable Eskom to meet the many obligations that it actually has. The way we look at Eskom is that we are on a journey. It's a medium-term journey, one which will take the next maybe 2 to 5 years, but it's a journey which over the last many decades, Eskom has traveled from becoming one of the foremost utilities in the world to one that declined under state capture and corruption, both in terms of its performance, but also in terms of its financial standing. And what we are going through currently is a third period of recovery and stabilization, and that will take us into a future where, through the transformation processes involving the roadmap and other obligations, Eskom will emerge as a modern utility with different components playing very different roles without the kind of vertical integration that we see currently. And embedded in this new journey that we are undertaking will be an important culture shift, as the Chair mentioned earlier on, one which is based on sound ethics and integrity, and where we can say that in a few years' time, we have got rid of all of the corrupt elements, and those that deserve to be in jail are in jail. But in the next few years, we can also say that the roadmap, Eskom roadmap, has been implemented, that the three components of that road of Eskom are fully operational, that we've fulfilled some of the obligations, but also government as a whole has delivered on the integrated resource plan and the kind of energy mix that has been provided for in that particular plan, and met the environmental obligations that we have as well. And the bottom line, if you like, in all of this is efficiency, supporting the economy in a crucial network industry, and maintaining a high standard of ethics and integrity in the processes that Eskom actually follows. I want to address some of the issues that have been raised in the context of the AGM and in the reports that you've actually heard. The first is that I think the country should be very proud of the fact that the apartheid legacy of no electricity being available to the majority of the population is basically fundamentally eroded with the electrification program. The second, I think that the Chief Executive should brief you on the renewable energy battery project. It's one of the top 3 or 4 projects of a similar kind anywhere else in the world. And the RFP in that regard has just been issued. And you will see how, notwithstanding dealing with the old legacy issues, we are currently dealing with the future issues as well, and engaging in the kind of innovative practices that one can see elsewhere in the world. So that is a huge plus as far as Eskom is concerned, and it will be a pace setter on the African continent and indeed in many other continents as well. The third element in this regard is the question of costs. While some progress has been made, as explained to you in the numbers provided, I think that there's a lot of space in the procurement area to continue the review of contracts agreed to in the past. Good work has been done in this regard. Summons have been issued, as the Chief Executive would have said, to the tune of some 3 billion rands to recover funds that have been lost through mismanagement of contracts as well. But one is particularly concerned with the massive increase in coal costs. In 2007, that constituted some 10 billion rands, and today, with basically the same fleet, except for Medupi and Kusile, that's about 66.6 billion rands that is spent on coal. Over a decade or so, that's an 85% increase in the cost of coal. And in tonnage terms, 117.4 million tons used to be bought and used in 2007 versus 119.3 million tons in 2020, a 2% increase in tonnage and 85% increase in costs. So the work in relation to reviewing whether they're short-term contracts or medium-term contracts must continue, and we need to have further interactions with the coal producers of this country to ensure that there's a fair deal for everyone concerned. The addition of 800 megawatts with the commercialization of the latest Kusile unit is also an important milestone that should be taken note of and gives Eskom more space to undertake the kind of maintenance work which will give us better assurances in the new year in terms of security of supply of energy. The payments culture amongst communities and as far as municipalities are concerned, the amount might seem small, 28 billion rands. That is on the record at the moment. But municipalities, we have to be frank, have also faced their share of challenges as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the unemployment that has followed, and the poverty that has increased amongst our people. And the Chief Executive correctly points out that we need to look for some structural solutions, which is what the Deputy President's team is currently looking at as well. Another important initiative that the board is putting in place is what they call an ethics assessment. In other words, what is the nature of the culture as far as integrity and good ethics is concerned within all levels of the organization? And that would be a pace setter for similar things to be done elsewhere amongst the SOC community in South Africa, so that we begin to move people in the right direction in terms of their ethical practices and behavior as well. As far as debt is concerned, we have to take note of the Eskom Compact that was agreed upon together with the Recovery and Reconstruction Plan within the context of NEDLAC by its various social partners. And that is an important common platform that all of South Africa can work on in order to place Eskom and electricity security on a much better footing as we get into the future. A particular concern that the CFO has raised is the question of debt. And I can say that the first round of work was done earlier in the year in terms of examining various debt options, and that remains on the table. But a second round of initiatives arising from the Eskom Compact will be initiated in the course of the next week. Once we have greater certainty about the direction in which those processes will go, will inform the financial community and other stakeholders in terms of where that process is going. What is very clear is that Eskom can't just rely on tariff increases to meet, whether they're cost reflective or not, to try to stabilize the ship within Eskom as described by the chief executive and the CFO. Something extraordinary needs to be done in terms of restructuring the debt or managing the debt differently. Once those processes, as I said, are nearing completion, we can give a little bit more detail about where we go. On the question of irregular expenditure, which the CFO explained to yourselves, I want to emphasize one point that emerged in the AGM earlier this morning, and that is that a large amount of that is historical, firstly, but secondly, there's a particular condonation process that has a long queue within the Treasury, and that an agreement has been reached between the Director General and the Treasury and the Chief Executive to fast-track some of those processes so that we actually get to a net number. And this applies not only to Eskom, but to many of the other state-owned entities as well, and is part of the cleanup, if you like, of the previous period, which is more than adequately described before Justice Zondo in the commission that he chairs presently. As far as government support is concerned, it's good that the government was able to come to the party and support Eskom through the numbers that you've actually seen. But what is absolutely clear is our short to medium term objective has to be that Eskom should not be a burden, like any other SOE should not be a burden on the fiscus in the country. But the restructuring process, both in an organizational sense, but also in the sense of business models and the kind of financial models that are being pursued in each of the different entities, will take time, but should not take too long a time before the objective of reliance on the fiscus is, or the reliance on the fiscus is actually removed. So I think it's important for the public to know that many of these initiatives that we are taking in many of the SOEs is not about increasing, inverted commas, the bailouts or increasing support. It's about ultimately removing the government support and each of the entities being able to stand on their own feet with the right level of government participation and the right level of private sector participation, which in the context of Eskom happens through private sector participation in both the renewable sector and other IPPs within the generation fold more generally. So if we talk about, and I'm beginning to conclude, the issue of structural reform, which is often mentioned by analysts in different parts of the world for governments to actually undertake, structural reform is not just a word or an easy ride to a different future. Once you find yourselves in the shoes of the CEO and the CFO and the management team and the workers at Eskom, it is about getting into the engine room of transforming a particular entity, taking tough decisions, meeting tough hurdles, overcoming those, but also having a clear vision about where we want to take that entity. And what you see happening in Eskom, and you are beginning to see in other SOEs as well, is the process of structural reform, which would take us towards a different kind of utility operating in South Africa. And in the case of Eskom, as the chief executive pointed out, the important issue is going to be, as we decommission power station plants that rely on coal, how do we ensure a just transition? A just transition for the workforce, for the community, the repurposing of power stations, which is becoming an exciting new area, and how we develop a social plan to cater for all of the people who are affected by the structural changes that need to be undertaken. I want to convey my condolences to the families of all of the contractors and workers who've lost their lives over the past period, which is truly regrettable. And one wishes the families well in the difficult circumstances they find themselves in. And finally, to congratulate the board, the management, and all 40,000 workers in Eskom for undertaking this bold and a very difficult journey of transforming Eskom, stabilizing Eskom, so that we create the right kind of platform for a different kind of Eskom in a few years' time. Thank you very much, Sikonati.
Thank you, Mr.
That
Kodan.
was a very muted response, you know.
After the pandemic, we will try harder, Mr. Gordon. Colleagues, at this point, we will take the first questions only for the minister so we can release him, and then the management team can account to your questions. Thank you. Tandiwe, please.
Thanks, Konati. We've got two questions for the minister. The first question is from Lisa Stein from Business Day. The question is, please could you provide insight as to what options are on the table to reduce the Eskom debt? And the second question is from Miriam Issa from Finwick, and her question is, in the medium-term budget policy statement, a senior treasury official said that Eskom had to meet certain conditions before receiving more help on its debt from the government. She said, once that was done, we can have a conversation. Could you explain what conditions are exactly? Have you any idea what debt restructuring might be achieved? Will it have to wait until divisionalization is complete? Those are the two questions.
Minister, did you get the questions?
No, I've got the questions. Thank you very much. So let me start with the latter question. Miriam, the conditions are fairly clear. I don't have all of them listed in front of me, but let me give you an idea of some of them. The first is, as has been pointed out, to implement the Eskom roadmap completely, and I think you've had an update from the Chief Executive, and the prime objective or immediate objective at the moment is to get this separate transmission entity on its own feet. The first steps in that direction have already been taken with the divisionalization process, the setting up of the boards, and the nitty-gritty work is currently being done in terms of how you separate. Now, you've heard this afternoon an integrated financial report, but there also needs to be a disaggregated financial report, which begins to say how does each of the entities, for example, generation, transmission, distribution, how are each of them positioned as far as their financial and other situations? Of we will be working with Eskom to speed up that process and make sure come down. The third was the concept of a chief structuring officer, but what Eskom has put in place is a chief strategy officer who is heading a program office that is monitoring and implementing the Eskom roadmap, and so that is very much in place as well. And then I'll link that to the debt question, where we were supposed to develop different options. So there were all sorts of options at the beginning of the year. The pandemic, of course, brought a stop to some of that conversations that were being had. And it's best not to go into any detail at this point in time. Let's give you a separate briefing, say in a month or so, when we have a clearer idea. But what we do want to communicate is that the issue of debt is being attended to as we go forward. Across all of the SOEs, as the Minister of Finance said in the MTBPS, issues of remuneration, benefits, board fees, etc., will have to be dealt with as well. So that's across the board as far as all of the SOEs are concerned, and we will certainly give some attention to that as we go forward. So those are some of the conditions, and they're fairly acceptable ones, because there should not be any funds received from the central fiscus if one is not complying with the basics in the organization. My own view is that the Eskom management team and board have done extremely well to deliver on the roadmap, and many of the conditions are work in progress, and more of that will be done as we go forward. Thank you very much to both Miriam and to Lisa.
Thank you, Mr. Kod. We just have one more question before you can escape. Please, Swazi.
Okay, this one is from Carol Payton at Business Day. She wants to know, what are your plans with regards to appointment of a new board or augmenting the current board?
Thanks, Carol. There is a governance process within a government that is underway at the moment. This board was appointed, I think, in January 2018. So we have indicated to the board that it's time for what is technically called a rotation. So we've confirmed the current board members in order to provide stability and continuity, at the same time recognizing that before the end of the year, a new board will be in place. Now, new doesn't mean that everybody in the old board is not there. We'll have to find the right balance between continuity and a set of skills that are appropriate to the kind of journey that Eskom is going to go through over the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kodan. I must tell you, colleagues and the Minister, that these results are for the year ended March 2020, which is a lot of water has flown under that bridge. We will soon be requesting your attendance again to account for the interim period in the 2021 financial year. At this point, I will take the questions for the executive, and my colleagues will help me through those. We have here in the hall some of my colleagues who will assist the management with the questions, and many more are on the call. However, if quite a lot many more at the power stations, I will not be able to respond to the questions. Thank you.
We have one from Paul at Bloomberg for the GCE. He says, in the most recent count of the debt, 488 billion. Is the most recent count of the debts 488 billion? If not, what is the latest? How much of that does Eskom expect could see improved terms due to green financing? Then we've got one from Chris Yeland. He says, what progress to date has been made in respect of restructuring of Eskom's debt? Who at Eskom is dealing with the restructuring of Eskom's debt? Who are Eskom's financial advisors on the restructuring of Eskom's debt? What are the timelines for restructuring of Eskom's debt?
Thank you, Sazi. Caleb, I guess these are your questions, but I just want to say in terms of Paul's question, these results are dealing with the year ended March 2020. And pretty soon we will do an update on the interim results. Thank you. Caleb?
Thanks, Paul. I think as you would expect, the debt wouldn't have moved much from March to now. There's been no solution that has been implemented. However, you'd appreciate that with the equity support, the significant closing balance at the end of March 2020, our debt at the end of September was slightly smaller than the year end. We ended at around 460 billion at the end of September, but understanding that some of our big maturities come to the end of this financial year 2021, where we then expect some of that debt to increase. We are very clear that we at all costs want to avoid not breaching significantly where we currently are.
to ask you if you have any closing message, Andre, and then Prof. Makhoba, in the absence of any further questions.
I don't have too much of a closing message, except that I think all of us at Eskom must be prepared to embrace the new change that is emerging out of this new leadership that you have. There is nothing that facilitates change than an embracement of change. And I think that is a very necessary component of what I think the staff of Eskom and the leadership of Eskom with the board can do, I think, to change this the big ship, as they call it, that often takes time to turn around in the big ocean. I think we must also be cognizant of the importance of Eskom. I think lots of people, when they hear about load shedding, the first thing they think about is the fact that it affects the economy. I often tell people that when you wake up in the morning and you are told there's load shedding, you don't think about the economy, you just get angry. So load shedding is on the well-being of a human being. And we often forget that we synonymize everything with money because of the economy. But actually, many people are either depressed, angry, and swearing at some of us. I have often remarked, I think, to my kids that since I became chairperson of Eskom, I've never had my ears itching in my life than I've had since I became chairperson, because every time there's load shedding, I know that I'm going to scratch my ears because people are either swearing at me and they don't want to see me on the road and so forth. But that's the challenge that we face. Finally, I think it's just to say that I think fixing Eskom is in all our interest. And really, it is all our business to fix Eskom for our own country, for our own future survival, and for our own competition and competitiveness in the world. So this is a big organization that needs all of us to put our little efforts into making it work for the future of our country. Thank you on that.
Thank you, Prof. Just to confirm, I want to make sure I heard you correctly in the beginning in your introduction. You said you're not leading a board of looters.
I want to repeat that. I think anybody who still is interested in looting must leave Eskom. It's as simple as that. We don't have that culture here. The EXCO will not tolerate it. The board will not tolerate it. I think somebody used to say when we were students, or I just arrived at WITS, the students used to say that they will hunt management like a pack of dogs until they find them. I think what we're going to do here at Eskom is to find and hunt the looters and get rid of them, I think, over the next couple of years or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Andre, any closing remarks? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We are free to go home. And, oh, sorry, you are not free yet, Andre. There's just one question from Lisa Stein of Business Day.
Yes, the question is from Lisa Stein. The question is for the GCE. Bloomberg reported that the publication of Eskom results was delayed because of overpayments related to the construction of its new Kusile power station and issues with the Eskom pension fund. Is that correct?
In his presentation, the Chief Financial Officer dealt exhaustively with both those issues, so I believe that that question has been answered in the presentation. Caleb, I think it was done.
We did cover it.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for your attention. We will shortly be requesting again your presence to hold us to account at the interim results stage. Thank you very much. Let's all keep safe.